Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second in the Atlantic KetMed webinar series. Today we'll be discussing scalable innovation using key enabling technologies. So the presentation will take perhaps an hour to an hour and a half. We're going to have it in 4 main segments, and between each section we will take questions. You should each have a video or have a text chat option on your Zoom interface. So if you post the questions on the text, we will take a break between each section and answer any questions that you have. We will first start off with an introduction to our project at Atlantic KetMed, and then our methodology for assessing scalable innovation. We'll look at how we can use the value chain of a product to identify the stakeholders, and how we can use this value chain and the stakeholder map to assess different applications of our product. Finally, we'll discuss the system model, which is an in-depth economic model for a sector, and how we use this to help us understand the potential for our product and its applications. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Gerard O'Connor, who will take us through the first part.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Just to say a few words of introduction for the Atlantic KetMed Consortium. So the Atlantic KetMed Consortium consists of partners that are distributed throughout the Atlantic area. And they consist of the International Iberian Nanotechnology Laboratory in Portugal, the FIDES Research Facility in the Clinical Hospital of Santiago de Compostela. There is then Alpha Nove, which is a research center in laser technologies in Bordeaux. And then there's Atlantpole Biotherapies, which is located just outside Nantes. And then in the UK, there is STFC, Daresbury, and there's BioNow. And then in Galway, there is the University NUI Galway. And it's through this partnership that we have been developing these tools that we're going to present to you this morning. So our project is called Atlantic KetMed. And so the KET means Key Enabling Technologies. And the spirit of the project is that we seek to identify which particular technologies throughout the 6 key enabling technologies identified for Europe, and try to apply them into the health domain. And this can be all aspects of health, well-being, and maybe associated with demographic change as well in terms of an older society. And so our key question is, what are the key enabling technologies that are important to this medtech sector? And then if we identify key enabling technologies, what's its potential to contribute or to add value to that sector? So KETs are very important within the European context and within the context of research generally. KETs tend to have this significant leverage effect. So developments using these key enabling technologies can have a dramatic impact on the area in which they're applied. So the diagram here suggests that some KET technologies can have a significant leveraging effect on health or ICT or energy or manufacturing or other consumer products. And the key kind of questions people tend to ask from the technology push side is, how do I get to know the new field of application in which I want to apply my photonic technologies or my micro and nano electronic technologies? Or maybe on the technology pull side is that if I have a product like a medical device, how can I leverage the new key enabling technologies? And those 2 questions are the questions we would endeavor to answer in this morning's webinar. So just to set the scene, I'll kick off and just introduce some concepts of key enabling technologies for scalable innovation. So we believe that KETs can transform particular areas of technologies. And this is part of the philosophy and the KET initiatives that have been undertaken by Europe over the last decade or so. And so here's some thoughts that just sets the scene for how our tool then can be implemented and developed. So the first thing we might ask is, what is innovation? And a nice phrase that we've come upon really is, innovation is all about realizing the full potential of an innovation. So to take something from an idea, which very few people or nobody's interested in, and trying to direct it towards an application takes a number of steps. And so maybe the first step is to take the idea and apply it to a particular application, then reconsider the idea again, and then apply it to maybe another application, which is more widely applicable to more than a few number of people, or to greater number of people. And then maybe revise the idea and then apply it again, so that you end up going from the bottom left-hand side of an idea that few people are interested in to the top right-hand side to an application of the idea where many people are interested in. And so this is really what innovation is about. It's about taking the invention and trying to gain widespread appeal for that invention. And it's an iterative process. So the next question that we found important was, how competitive is the innovation that we propose? And so we tried to understand the 5 forces of competition. And these are the 5 forces of competition that Porter introduced for the first time, maybe in the late 90s, but more recently in 2008. And so Porter kind of identifies 5 forces of competition. The one that we're most familiar with perhaps are rivalry. So where our product competes with other products. And so really, in terms of trying to overcome rivalry, it can be really difficult, particularly if you're a similar size organization than everybody else. If your technology is doing the same thing as everybody else's, that competition can really be intense. And often it's price that determines the outcome. But there are other forces associated with competition. Maybe bargaining power of buyers is an important force. So if we've many buyers who are interested in our technology, that bargaining power decreases. Likewise, if we've got a bargaining power of, if we consider the bargaining power of suppliers here, so if we're reliant on a technology that only 1 or 2 people can provide, that's bad for our product, because we've little or no bargaining power. So again, trying to understand the full range of suppliers is an important activity in making our product more competitive. The other aspects that we have to be mindful are the threat of substitute products or technologies which may undermine our technology. Or maybe the threat of new entrants coming into the field. A new way of doing things is also something that we have to consider. So again, in this presentation, this is really important, these 5 forces. We're really trying to expand the network of enterprises and stakeholders that can reduce these bargaining powers and identify what these threats may be. The second point I'd like to make regarding innovation that's really captured in a value chain analysis tool is the geographical aspect, or the regional motivation. We think geography is really important. And so if we look to the center of this diagram and we focus on the product concept, a way we can think of our product concept is that it takes the input resources that we have at our availability and translates them, or adds value to them, towards demanding stakeholders. And we don't do this independently of all other actors. We are supported by other stakeholders. They may be related or supporting stakeholders down the bottom. And we also tend to do this product development or innovation in a overall context where we're competing with other organizations and where there's a strategy to counteract that rivalry. So this is the concept of a diamond, and a diamond is really quite important, again, according to Porter. And Porter captures the inputs there, the local resources, the infrastructure, the quality and the specialization as being important contributors to our product concept. The demanding stakeholders, typically we ideally like to work with sophisticated and demanding customers, because if we can satisfy their needs, well, then our product will be all the more robust and better for it. And ideally we'd like to work with local customers whose needs really anticipate a global need elsewhere. So if we can satisfy our local customers, which are very accessible to us, well, then we can also be well placed to address the more lucrative, perhaps, global needs. And many times our demanding stakeholders respond to a specialized need that exists locally, which again are globally relevant. So it's good to kind of position your product where that also applies. So our product concept also must leverage off what's available locally in terms of support. So the local based engineering companies or suppliers quite important, or other competitive industries may be important, who may address a similar problem but in a different way. And then in terms of the rivalry, this innovation tends to work best where the rivalry is really intense at a local level, but also translates into a global stage. So that's the kind of regional consideration. So we're particularly interested in identifying what are the stakeholders that exist regionally to support our innovation or our development of a product concept. So the first step along our path of doing this analysis of trying to develop a product concept that may exploit some key enabling technology is as follows, is to define a product concept. And then we subject this product concept to a number of steps. And the 4 steps are identified there in the chart. But for the moment, we just consider the product concept. So what kind of thinking goes behind the product concept? So first thought that you might say, I'm going to make a product, where would I position this product in the market? So you may have a product that perhaps is based on a key enabling technology like a photonics or a materials-based technology. Where would I start? Well, you have 2 options, if we could break it down as follows, is that you could start with your photonics-based product and you could try and apply it into a photonics market. So here your actual product is photonics and you're applying it into a new existing market in the same sector. So that's going vertically from the bottom left there upwards to the top left. More often, we take a technology and we try to apply it into a new market, into a new domain that we're not sure of. But here we're exploiting the leverage effects of the photonics tool and applying it into a new area. So, and this is the challenge that we would like to try and understand, is how do we get to understand the new market? The other aspect that we will introduce, and we'll introduce it more in more detail later, is that we'll try to identify what is the overall system in which the product concept seeks to address. And so we've been very interested in this textbook called Scalable Innovation by Stein and Stein. The reference is down there in the left-hand corner, where we develop a product concept and we think of it as a tool that delivers a function to a product. And so that tool really, for it to operate or to transform or to modify or to perform some work, if we want to express it like that, it has to take some inputs into it. And the inputs, if we think really generally, come from a source. And the source can be a source of energy, it can be a source of materials or mass or matter, or it can be a source of information. And so oftentimes we can break down our product concept into these particular aspects of taking the sources of energy, mass, and information and getting them to the tool in a very efficient way. So this really involves a distribution channel. So we've sources and we try to get them into a distribution channel, and we do that in discrete amounts, which we call package payloads. So in the case of energy or electricity, this distribution channel may be a wire, and in case of the package payloads, it might be the details of how the current is supplied from the source towards the tool. And of course, it moves through the wire, but then there's an interface between the wire and the tool. So we think about the interface as being quite important there. And there's then some switch or some control element to the system model that describes our product concept. The important thing about the system model is that people understand that a well-designed system model for a product concept positions the concept on the path so that it can progress along an S-curve. The S-curve is the characteristic curve that's often associated with successful technologies, where their performance or their adoption increases with time. So when you start with a new technology, maybe the performance is quite limited. It's low. The adoption is low. It's just adopted by the innovators. And then suddenly its performance begins to evolve. Its adoption grows, usually taken up by the early adopters, the brave people. And then it kind of evolves to a late majority, an early majority and late majority. And then the people at the end eventually accept the new technology, the laggards, and they use it. And then the technology cycle begins to saturate. A newer technology comes on, or this technology is fully developed and fully applied. And so this S-curve really has been linked in several cases to the synthesis of the system model and the evolution of the system model with time. So people suggest that in terms of getting early adopters to take on board the technology, you need a well-synthesized system model. You need to maybe evolve the system model then towards a dominant design to grow further. Then you need to address issues relating to the distribution channels in terms of the buildup of the materials, the energy and the information that's delivered to the tool. That might need a new infrastructure. And then you need to optimize the infrastructure efficiency to really fully exploit the technology along the S-curve. So that's just a brief introduction to the system model and the S-curve, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. So the next aspect that's really quite important is the technical value chain for the product concept. So of course, value comes from a number of areas in an enterprise. And for this morning's discussion, I'm only focusing on the technical value chain for the product concept. I'm not thinking about maybe the infrastructure of the company or the enterprise, the human resources capability, the logistics, which might add significant value to the enterprise. I'm just focusing on the product. So the product concept in our value chain analysis tool, we center the value chain on that product concept. And so we look at the technical value chain as having two components. It has a technology side that contributes technology into the product concept in green, and it has the product concept then that's applied to maybe an application, towards an end user product, and to a societal challenge that's given in red there on the right-hand side. And so really, we believe that understanding the technical value chain is really important for positioning a product concept for future success. And we'll describe the tools over the next few slides by which we analyze this technical value chain. It's really important to understand that the competitiveness is really linked to the product's value chain. So again, in this representation, the product is central to our value chain. And there are substitutes and new entrants which compete with our products that we think we also have to be aware of their impact on our product concept. Our product also rivals with other products, so we have to be mindful of that. And then we have maybe technologies or stakeholders that provide technologies into our product from the left, and they really refer to the bargaining power of the technology suppliers. We want many different suppliers to be identified that can provide really good solutions so that our product can flourish. Then on the right-hand side, our product address particular applications. And we would like to have a number of applications so that we're not dependent on a single bargaining power of a buyer. And so in terms of developing our product's technical value chain, we try to identify the different stakeholders that will be associated with this value chain. And we assess those stakeholders, maybe in terms of how relevant they are to our development, and also in terms of the technology readiness level of what they have to offer and what we have to offer other applications downstream from our product. So the technical value chain for a product, really the demand side is typically the primary focus initially. So enterprises are very comfortable to have the demand side of their value chain analyzed. There's a lot of technology and proprietary information and know-how associated with the technology side. So for the remainder of this presentation, we'll largely concentrate just on the demand side. But the approach we propose is also very relevant for the technology side. So I'm going to hand over pretty shortly now to identify what is the application of the product. And here we're going to try and help you identify ways to identify the different stakeholders. So Ian,
thank you, Ger. Before we do that, I'll just see if there's any questions. Are there any questions from the room for Ger? I just very quickly check our messages. So we haven't any messages at the moment. That's okay. We'll stop again for an opportunity to ask questions later. So Ger has told us about how the technical value chain is essential to how we analyze the idea, the new product concept. And this technical value chain has been conceived with high-tech products in mind. So the products that use the key enabling technologies. And so this is a very specific analysis type for these high-tech products. And the structure that we saw before of the value chain and the demand side, what we do when we engage with a company or engage with an idea is we try and elaborate the concept of the product into the demand tree. So this single product might have multiple applications that we're considering, and each application might enable one or more end user products. And these end user products will be motivated by societal challenges. So we work closely with the person and people who have conceived of the product concept to try and understand how the product penetrate or might penetrate into the sector. I'm going to refer a number of times today to an example that we did here for LiDAR. So here we can see a LiDAR application where the product is defined as a light-based range measurement. And you can see that the applications, there's detection and avoidance, geolocation, mapping, and each of these enable a different end-use product. And each of these end-use products is motivated by a separate challenge related to safety, to self-driving cars, to the environmental monitoring, speed enforcement, and so forth. So this is the kind of the real crux of how we go about analyzing the product, by building this this value chain, this demand side value chain. These keywords, these phrases that we have here, are used subsequently to identify the stakeholders. So for us to really understand how our product might work, or if it could work in the sectors that we're proposing, we need to understand who the players are, who the stakeholders are that might be using our product, and why they might use it. Which brings us to the second part of our value chain analysis technique, which is to identify the stakeholders. So, as I mentioned a second ago, we need to have these stakeholders understood, and we use the value chain, the technical value chain, to map them. So the first question that you might ask is, well, who are the stakeholders? Where are the stakeholders? The preferred analysis would look at the entire planet. So a global assessment of all the stakeholders possible for your product. But this is a almost impossible task. The second, and perhaps the best option, is to look at a regional context. Just look at those stakeholders within your country, within your region, within Europe perhaps, which is very useful, but it presents a problem of how do you restrict to just those stakeholders. Local stakeholders are most likely already known, but they will also be encompassed within the regional. And the second question you want to have for your stakeholders is, which sector do you want to look at? So what we do for our analysis technique is we look at industry clusters. So industry clusters are a very important resource for understanding the regional and sector stakeholder availability. So throughout Europe, there are a vast number of industry clusters where you have a managed sector of a particular type of company aiming towards a particular technology or a particular application. For that LiDAR value chain that I showed earlier, we explore the automotive sector, green energy sector, security, aviation, and we use resources like Cluster Observatory and the European Secretariat for Cluster Analysis to identify the clusters that are associated with these different sectors. And then there are a number of tools that we use to figure out who the members are and find the company website of those members from these resources. So for example, on the European Secretariat for Cluster Analysis, there are 24 gold-level clusters in France. These are well-managed clusters, and they have been organized by the portfolio, so by the sector that they're involved with. And many of these will have multiple hundred members, all in that particular sector. The Cluster Observatory categorizes clusters into 41 different sectors. So it really allows you a high degree of specificity in who and what you're looking at and where you're looking at. So typically for our Atlantic KetMed project, we would look at clusters in Europe in the medical device sector, in health, and so forth, in the key enabling technologies, to understand how we can help companies, perhaps such as yourselves, to take their medical device to the next step through a firm understanding of the stakeholders in our region. So how do we specifically find the stakeholders? Well, we use a technology solution, a software solution, and it's called a custom search engine. So Google offered a version of a custom search engine that would allow you to specifically search only the websites that you're interested in. We have since built our own version, which is for Atlantic KetMed, where we have identified 10,000 companies throughout the Atlantic area and throughout Europe that are in the target sector domains for the majority of the KET-enabled medtech companies that we're interested in engaging with. And we have downloaded every single website. We have almost 2 million documents downloaded and indexed that we use to identify the stakeholders. What it boils down to is, in a simple term, is we have a whole bunch of websites that are our custom search engine. So we have almost 10,000 websites from across multiple sectors, across many, many clusters that form the Atlantic KetMed custom search engine. And what we do is we take our value chain, which we have worked out in great detail with the people who have proposed the product, and we take the keywords from each section of that value chain and we use them to find stakeholders. So we basically we plug it into the search engine to find who are the people that we need to work with. Now, in order to manage our stakeholders, we've created a spreadsheet tool which allows us to organize them, categorize them, and score them. And we'll talk in more detail about the scoring later on. But we have our software tool. It's categorized into the product, the application, and so forth. So each of these has its own segment within our spreadsheet, where we can identify the companies, the stakeholders who might be interested in being part of our network. It all starts at the product, identifying the rivals, the substitutes, really any competitor. So we take our product concept, we enter it into our search engine, we try and identify who are the people who are going to compete with us directly. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to have a very deep understanding of the current market and how our unique selling points are going to be positioned. What are our value propositions and how do they correspond with the other players who are offering something similar to what our product would offer. Further on the value chain, so in the application, the end-use product, societal challenge, what we're concentrating on is a value proposition. So how would our product concept create value for the stakeholder? And this value proposition is key then to how we go about scoring the stakeholders. So we're interested in scoring and weighting these stakeholders to have an understanding of how our different applications may or may not be successful. In the most simple terms, if we have a strong understanding of the product and a strong understanding of how it works within the system, we can easily generate a value proposition. And this becomes our litmus test for the stakeholders that we find through our custom search, whether to include them in our spreadsheet or not. So we capture a number of pieces of information about the stakeholder, including the value proposition, and then we apply a certain technique to score them. So we have a number of questions that we ask and answer, and we capture them within that search engine or that spreadsheet. So that's the next section of our analysis technique, where we score the stakeholders. So I'm going to pause again and just see if there's any questions. Any questions from the room?
Maybe there is one question, just maybe you glossed over it there, just in terms of what are the tools by which you gather the information from the websites? Could you just
to gather the information from the website?
The website addresses and then you load them into the search tool.
Okay, so we have a number of tools. Now this is by no means complete, but there are a number of free tools. Often they take the form of a plugin to your web browser that allow you to extract hyperlinks. For instance, NoParse. That allows you to extract all the hyperlinks on a page. So if you're on a cluster web page, a members page, you can simply click on NoParse, and if the website or the URL for the company is listed, it will be extracted to the clipboard. Link Grabber does something similar. If you can do it the old-fashioned way. You can email the cluster and ask them for a list of the members. There's a number of techniques. Okay. We've used them in great depth, and we have approximately 10,000 of these companies identified and cataloged.
And the value of using, the motivation for us using our own search engine is just to avoid getting the Google preferences that we can't really control. So we can set our own search terms and we get our results back free from any bias. Yeah.
So we have one question online. Will we get a copy of the presentation? Yes. So everyone will get a copy of the presentation, and you'll also have access to the video of this presentation very soon. So I'm going to hand back over to Ger to talk about how to score the stakeholders.
Yes, so thanks, Ian. So in terms of the scoring the stakeholder, what's really important to us here is this value proposition. We represent this as a link here in our diagram. And so this link is really centered on how does the product concept meet the expectation of the application or the stakeholder who's managing the application. And so in terms of meeting the expectation, we really see that that's providing value. And it's really important that the different stakeholders all add value to the product concept. And so in terms of scoring, we score this value proposition. And we can score it along the technology side. So if there's a component or a subsystem that comes into the product concept, we want to be very clear what is the function of that component or subsystem. What's the value? We score that value. On the demand side, we take our product concept and we want to be clear in terms of the contribution that that product concept makes to the stakeholder's application or end user product. Okay. We then consider also the application and how for that stakeholder and how that contributes to the end user product and how the end user product would add value to the to addressing a societal challenge. But the value proposition is very important. So scoring is really the third part of our thought process here. And scoring the value proposition that connects the stakeholders is where it's all centered on. So there's three elements to our scoring. The first thing we do is we score the stakeholders themselves. So the very basics there, we just see if the stakeholder is in a related activity. Is it aligned with our enterprise or with our product development? And the very basic question, how will the stakeholder grow and help us develop our technology? Another question we might ask is, how, if the stakeholder might be conflicted, maybe they're involved with the competition, or maybe they're of a particular scale that they could usurp us in the future and maybe take over a product concept and we may not have control. Another question that's really important is how engageable is the stakeholder? So will we be able to grab and hold the attention of the stakeholder so that we can develop our concept? And then maybe how do we foresee the working relationship developing? So those kind of aspects come together and we score the stakeholder. So we say, the stakeholder is going to get a score and that score becomes part of our analysis. The second aspect is the technology readiness level of the value proposition. So again, if we've an enterprise that's providing a component or a subsystem into our product, ideally we would like that the technology readiness level of that component or subsystem to be really high so that we can depend on that component. So maybe it would have a TRL or 8 or 9 there. That would be the best case. If our product is going into another person's application or another person's end user product, we would like the technology readiness level of their application or their end user product to be a little bit shy of being at 8 or 9, just so that it's in the development phase, so that we believe that there is scope for our technology to make an impact or to be considered in their overall product. If the product is already at 9, there's no point really chasing that application. So again, in our algorithm, we score the technology readiness level of the value propositions along the value chain. The bit that's really interesting for us is trying to assess the third aspect, the innovation potential of our product concept. And so there's two aspects to the innovation potential. There's a technical aspect, and then there's a market aspect. So the first question we would ask in terms of scoring is, how much is the technology suddenly possible? So if we've got a technology and we're basing our new product concept on that technology, we'd like to know, is it new? If it is new, perhaps we believe it has a greater chance of success than if it existed for a number of years or for a long time. So we score how suddenly possible the technology would be. We also consider maybe the enterprise, if the person who's dealing with this may have the resources to prototype or develop the concept. So if our concept was going into an application, would our stakeholder have the resources to use it, maybe in their prototyping and their developing? And if they have, we become quite interested. We score that highly. Maybe if the stakeholder has sufficient expertise to exploit the product concept is another question. So, we believe we need to do things that are challenging, that involves a high skill level in many cases, and the level of expertise is an important aspect to realize some impact. So we score that. And then we consider where the technology is on the S-curve. So if it's at the very bottom or the very top, maybe there's a lot of risk associated with that, so we'd score that lowly. But if it's maybe, just above the base on the rising part of the S-curve, we would score that quite highly. In terms of the market perspective, we would assess the innovation potential in terms of whether the innovation is desperately needed. If something is suddenly possible and desperately needed, this becomes very interesting, could be a breakthrough. So we score desperately needed in terms of if it's needed urgently, we score that highly. If it's not so needed or somewhat needed, we score it more lowly. So how accessible then is the market that exists for the proposed development? That's an important concept in terms of trying to get the product to the market. And the accessibility is really the key thing that we're trying to score here. Is there a way that we can access people who in turn can access the end user market? And so if it's accessible, we score that highly. We also consider then how readily available are a crowd of creative first adopters. These are the people who would take on board a new approach eagerly. And so if they're available, we score that aspect highly. And then beyond that, in order to realize scalable innovation, how accessible are the markets of a multitude of the global markets? Can we foresee ways of accessing that market? And if we can, we score that highly. And so in terms of bringing these markets, these scores together, then we have a spreadsheet to do that, and Ian will describe how that spreadsheet works.
So for each of our elements of the value chain, I just reiterate that our spreadsheet has its own page. So we're looking currently at the applications page for the LiDAR, the light ranging, measurement and ranging value chain analysis we conducted. So you can see that each of our applications is represented on the top left. We can have as many or as few as we wish. And we have put them keywords, those key phrases, through our search engine to identify the stakeholders. So you can see there on the right-hand side, we have a single stakeholder highlighted. They're related to the speed measurement. So we link our stakeholder. We have spent some time on their website to identify what it is that they offer, and that is hyperlinked on in the name column. We identify what part of the value chain they're from and a brief little element of what it is that they do. And then the all-important value chain is captured in our spreadsheet tool. We capture some information on the system model, so whereabouts they are positioned on the system model, and we'll get into that later. And then we get into the simple questions that Jared explained a few moments ago, but if they're in a related activity, if they're conflicted, if they're engageable. And these are very simple questions, but they're critical to how you can interact with this stakeholder. And our algorithm incorporates these into the final score. We then progress on to some of the more detailed questions. What is the TRL at which they could integrate our product? And what is is the technology suddenly possible? These innovation potential questions that we talked about a moment ago. These all contribute into our final algorithm on the right-hand side to auto-generate a score. So the score incorporates all of the answers that we had previously. It incorporates the technology readiness level as a weighting factor. It incorporates our stakeholder score, and it incorporates at which level the stakeholder might use our product to try and give us a numerical assessment of all of these stakeholders. And each stakeholder is associated with a particular part of that value chain. So we use these scoring to help us understand which application might be the most successful, and which one might have the most traction within the sectors that we're targeting. So what the scoring allows us to do is it allows us to, first off, identify the applications that are the most successful, but also then to identify the stakeholders who might be scoring above average, who would be the ones that you should potentially engage with at an early stage. And we will see now in a moment how we go about building our system using these stakeholders, which is the next segment. And I'll just pause again for questions. If there's any questions from the room. As we don't have any questions online, I just want to mention that if anyone wants to contact us after the webinar for more details, then please feel free to do so.
I suppose maybe a comment on the scoring. I suppose the scoring is often quite subjective to the individual who does it. And so we, this tool, this value chain analysis tool or approach, it's very much a coaching tool. And we encourage a number of different people to participate in the analysis so that they all provide their scores. And the scores, if you like, can capture different opinions. But it's still got this numerical side that helps you to make an informed decision at the end. But it is rather subjective. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And we've done what we can to try and remove this subjectivity as far as we could. But to incorporate the different elements that might be related to concepts like venture capital, there is a certain level of subjectivity, and that's why it is important that we are engaging constantly with others who understand the market really well, who understand the product really well, to try and place some of these concepts into that broader picture and get a larger mass of opinion to try and even out the subjectivity. So we have a question from the room.
Yeah, you're working off a database of 10,000 companies.
About 10,000, yeah.
And does that account for startups that have come up since you've developed that database?
No, it has not. So the database is static, and we refresh it at various intervals, and it's not supposed to represent the entirety of the global stakeholders. It's supposed to just be a subset to help us understand how our product might penetrate into our regional sectors. So it's not supposed to capture everything. It's just supposed to be a representative subset. But we do know that there are elements out there that we don't understand, and that's why this is an iterative process. So when we perform a value chain analysis, it really is just the foundation to start the next value chain analysis and really drill down on our applications and how our product could penetrate into the marketplace. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So we mentioned earlier about the system model and how the system model is a critical part of how the product can scale that S-curve of growth. can see here it's represented by a very simple graphic. On the left you have the sources, on the right you have the tools. They're connected by a distribution which allows things called packaged payloads to go from one side to the other. And then outside is the control. So I'm going to first off explain this in a little more detail so that you can understand. I'll give you a few examples, and then I will show you how we take our stakeholders that we've identified through our value chain, and we try to build a system model or try to show what the system that exists currently might be for a product. So in the most broad sense, the system model is an economic system. So it's a marketplace. And in any marketplace, goods and services are traded. And for our high-tech CHET-enabled products, we're talking about things like mass, energy, and information that are exchanged. So the energy, mass, or information, it originates at the source, and it's used or transformed at the tool. And it gets from the source to the tool through space or time via distribution. And the particular format it must be in to be used by the tool is called the package payload. And somehow the interactions between the different elements are under a control. So a useful way to think about it is that the tool produces the meaningful output of the system, and that the source, these are the essential elements for the operation of your product. The distribution is the pathway between the essential elements of the product, and the package payload is the format that the product can use these essential elements in. The control controls the user experience. It defines how these elements interact. And a key point that we will examine is the interfaces. So these are the points where your sources enter the control, the distribution enters the tool. And these are points where significant value can be created for a company. So probably the easiest way to explain this is through examples. The most successful photonics product of all time is the light bulb. The light bulb, its meaningful output is it generates light. Now, the essential elements for it to operate is, well, it needs electricity. So that's, you can see on the left we have sources of electricity. They travel to the light bulb via a distribution. So this is the electrical grid, your domestic circuitry. And there's a particular format that it must take to be usable by our tool. So the correct voltage, the correct frequency needs to be matched for our light bulb to actually work. And of course, you have to have some control. So there's control of the national grid has control, and locally you have control. You've got a light switch. And once you have the elements of source and the control and the distribution in place, you can easily conceive that other tools might be possible within this system. So tools could be a hairdryer, a washing machine. If we look at the interfaces, so the interface between the light bulb and the distribution is the socket. And this, in fact, is where Edison made his fortune. He protected that interface, the bayonet interface, that allowed the light bulb to connect with the distribution network. A more technical example is the iPhone. So the iPhone, its meaningful output is information to the user. And of course, it needs information in at the source to produce information out. So you have developers, you have users, you have advertisers, and so on that are creating these different sources of information. And this information needs to take particular formats, be it apps, be it audio files, video files. These are well-defined formats that it must take, and they travel through a distribution network. So it could be the internet, it could be mobile cells. There is the interface, which perhaps is Wi-Fi or the cellular network. And then where Apple extracts all its value is in the control side. So it has the App Store and iTunes, where it generates significant revenue. And Apple has examined this system carefully, and they have protected various points between the different system elements, and they have protected these interfaces. A more practical example might be a car. Its meaningful output is transportation. Essential elements that go in will be power. So it needs an engine or a battery to produce power. That power has to take a particular format, in this case, torque. The torque is distributed from the source, the engine, via a drivetrain. There is an element of control, and once you have the sources and the distribution, you can conceive of other tools in your system. It could be a motorbike, etc. And not only can you have one system independently, but you can have systems where you can have stacked systems, so nesting doll systems, where you have a system within a system. So our internal combustion engine has essential elements for its use. So petrol or diesel, and this must come in a particular format, and it has particular controls. So what we try to do is we try to build a system around our product. So we try to understand what our product is and how it sits within the broader picture. So in this case, LiDAR. So if we identify our product as light-based range measurement, we can conceive of different tools across agriculture, aerospace, industrial control, automotive, and you can see that various essential elements are necessary. So location trackers, scanners, optics, and so on and so forth. And these must take particular formats to get there. And when we have built out our control, we try and take all of these stakeholders who were the top scoring stakeholders and build them into our system. And this is an opportunity for us to present to the people who are proposing our product what the system looks like, where there might be gaps, and who the key players are. So you can see in this example, some of the key players on the tool part are Bosch, ZTE, Leica Geosystems. There's a very good representation under the tools. Under the distribution, we have Volvo, Valeo, Kioxis, Cisco. These are all highly scoring stakeholders who, and there's a very good representation under distribution. But when we come to the sources, we found when we performed our analysis that there were far fewer sources for the LiDAR than there were tools, controls, or distribution. So we had maybe 3 high-scoring source providers. So from this example, we can see that there's perhaps this system is less complete than it needs to be, that we don't have the depth of the sources available at the moment for the LiDAR to become a truly scalable innovation. And this opens up a number of questions, and it's possible that this is an opportunity for a stakeholder who is positioned on the sources to help expand this entire system. It might require that you re-examine this application if you don't have the resources to help build out the missing elements. And further then, if we have an immature system model, there could be the opportunity for a stakeholder to examine these interfaces. So how the data, the information gets to the tool. It could be an important point to explore some intellectual property to try and extract the maximum value from the system. So on our basic system model, we populated with the stakeholders. The stakeholders, the ones who scored the highest, the ones who have proven through our analysis technique to be the key stakeholders. We build up the entire system, the economic system model, looking for opportunities for IP, gaps, and we pose these questions to the people who are proposing our product. You know, how do we fill the gaps? How do we exploit the IP possibility? And all the time we're looking towards the scalability, this S-curve of growth, and how to make sure that everything that we need for our idea, our product concept, to climb that S-curve is in place before investing too heavily in it. So just a quick recap on our value chain analysis, we end up with a comprehensive list of the regional stakeholders that we can score. So we have an understanding of how our different applications might penetrate into the marketplace and who the key players might be. We have looked at the system model and we've seen what the gaps might be and where the opportunities might be. And now we have the opportunity to reassess our product concept. So before we spent a penny on doing any development, we can analyze the market side and understand whether there is an opportunity to advance there. And that's why we say this is an iterative process. So we return back to the definition of the product. So Jared, do you want to take over from here?
Okay, so just wrapping up then in terms of the overall impact of the value chain analysis. Really, it's ideally suited to provide an early stage assessment of a product concept. So it's most suited as well maybe where you've got a high technology or a tech application which is seeking to address a problem in a new field, a field that we're not familiar with. And we believe our value chain analysis allows the team to really quickly get an understanding of what's important in that new field of application. And in so doing, then you can understand better what is the value of the product concept in that field, or how your product can meet the expectation of that field. So it really is an important methodology really in setting the direction for future R&D activities. So in the scores that we get back, there may be a particular field of application which is scoring more highly than another, that then might set out an agenda for research and development that people should follow. There may be something in the TRL that might identify a gap, or in the system model that identifies a gap. That gap has to be plugged. Again, that can identify what the R&D activity will be. We believe our value chain analysis is also interesting in terms of developing technologies that are suited for scalable growth, of scalable innovation. And this is really because we're thinking in terms of the challenges of getting the matter, the mass, the energy, and the information to our tool for an appropriate output. And the last benefit of the value chain analysis is that at the end of the value chain analysis, having spent a week or so working on it, that you'd have a populated pathway, or you'd have a list of stakeholders that could be contactable to help you realize the product concept. So that's the overall impact, I think I would summarize it. And maybe just in terms of the context of the value chain analysis to the Atlantic KEPMED project, which is where we've kind of really further developed this concept from previous European activities, is that the Atlantic KEPMED started by mapping stakeholders throughout the Atlantic area in the field of key enabling technologies and medtech. And then we began with our partners to undertake innovation audits with some various micro and small to medium-sized enterprises. And then we have identified some of those innovation audits to be interesting. Companies are interested in pursuing further in terms of the value chain analysis. And this is the process that we're undertaking with those partner companies. These innovation audits, the value chain analysis, will hopefully identify opportunities for our training and webinars such as we're doing now, and also for the development of new procedures or feasibility studies in our labs, and maybe future funding opportunities, which within the Atlantic KEPMED project, a number of them can be encompassed as part of a transnational case study. So involving partners from different regions in bringing a demonstrator forward. So that's the context in terms of Atlantic KEPMED. And maybe just to give you a sense of the deliverables that we'd expect. So we're undertaking 50 innovation audits. We have a challenge of 25 value chain analysis to undertake. We're embarking on these actively now. We've got some various training programs, opportunities for hot desks, some procedures of feasibility studies for about 25 cases, and then we think about 5 demonstrators would be progressed. And so hopefully, if these are of interest to you, we encourage you to make contact with us, or maybe make contact with one of our partners that are listed on the Atlantic KetMed website. So finally, just we can have a look at the questions, but I'd just like to acknowledge the Atlantic KetMed team, all the partners who have contributed greatly to the development of the tool. Many iterations of discussions, and the system is still in development, but it's evolving very well. And we look forward to working with you on these applications of interest. And we also would just like to formally acknowledge our grant. The grant number is listed there, but the Interreg Atlantic area, who provide funding as well as our own institutions to these activities. Yeah. So maybe I'll leave it at that. We can check once again if there's any questions.
Just before we go, I just wanted to say that before we go into the questions, that this is part of our education outreach, these webinar series, and we have a survey for companies to try and understand what the needs are, and it will be incredibly helpful for us and for yourselves if you would take a few moments and fill in the survey. So I will email this to all the people at this webinar, and it's also available on our website. If you could take a few moments, fill in the survey so that we can understand what the needs are and how to position the next webinar in the series. And also there's going to be more local training on specific elements of company needs. So it's a very important part of making this relevant, and your help will be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, and indeed, if there's any feedback on the webinar, would be quite good as well. If you heard us okay, if the presentation slides were okay, we're open to that constructive criticism. Yeah.
Have we any questions from the room first before we go take online questions?
All quiet. Okay.
All quiet. All right. Well, I encourage everyone again to make contact if you have any need for further information. And thank you for your time and attention. And hopefully we'll see you at the next in our webinar series, which we would propose will happen in the coming spring. Thank you very much.